Sure, to be a poet, all you need is a notebook, a window, and a willingness to laugh a little too loudly. But what do you need to be a good poet? Well, that's easy. Write some bad poems, just not forever. Welcome back to our poetry course for new poets, experienced poets, and even maybe skeptical not yet poets. Right now, we're in the phase of building a broader vision of poetry. Last time, we talked about the basic qualifications for being a poet, and today our goals are to help you loosen up a little, because new poets often do need a lot of loosening up, to help you get better at reading poems thoughtfully, and to show you the most common traps that new writers fall into. If we were in a classroom setting, today's discussion would also have the purpose of showing you the kinds of things I make comments about most commonly on the poems students submit. You could think of it as a way of alerting you to feedback I'd probably give you on a first draft, so you can give yourself that feedback before I have to. Now, of course, your grade doesn't depend on you sending me poems, because you're not sending me poems and I'm not giving you a grade, but I think this is still going to be helpful for you as you work on your own poems. Put simply, by the end of today's video, I hope you'll be inoculated against the most common and most serious problems that might show up in a new writer's poetry. Sounds fun, right?
No, and your understanding of fun really should be studied by science.
Oh, come on, I think you'll like this one. You do like criticism, don't you?
Criticism? Yeah, especially when it's overwhelming and devastating.
Well, we probably won't go that far, but as a place to start, let's take a look at this poem by everyone's favorite Edgar Guest. Send her a valentine. Send her a valentine to say you love her in the same old way. Just drop the long familiar ways and live again the old-time days, when love was new and youth was bright, and all was laughter and delight. And treat her as you would if she were still the girl that used to be. Pretend that all the years have passed without one cold and wintry blast, that you are coming still to woo your sweetheart as you used to do. Forget that you have walked along the paths of life where right and wrong and joy and grief in battle are, and play the heart without a scar. Be what you were when youth was fine, and send to her a valentine. Forget the burdens and the woe that have been given you to know, and to the wife so fond and true that pledges of the past renew. 'Twill cure her life of every ill, to find that you're her sweetheart still. Now, before we really get into it, I want to say that there's nothing wrong with liking this poem if you do. Like we said last time, a poet's first job is to be of service. So if this poem is of service to you in some way, that's great. Don't let me take that away. Also, Edgar Guest was a hugely popular and prolific poet, so nothing I say is really going to harm him. However, I do think this poem's pretty bad.
Wow, there's the unsparing criticism we've been waiting for.
Actually, I think that there are several reasons that this poem just doesn't live up to its potential. Sure, it rhymes, it has a regular rhythm, and all those things you'd expect from a poem on the surface, but it just isn't really delivering the kind of poetic experience that it could. You might already have some ideas about why, but before I get into what I find problematic about this piece, I want to show you some love poems that I think are much, much better models for your own writing. They're all linked below so you can read them in their entirety, but I do want to talk through some highlights. And let's begin with Jane Kenyon's translation of one of Anna Akhmatova's poems. It zooms in on two people walking along a snowdrift in silence. In that silence, the poem evokes two sounds that are the soundtrack of this pair's walk. The trembling of branches we brush against, the soft ringing of your spurs. This piece doesn't do any of the overtly lovey-dovey stuff that the Guest poem does, but I think it's a much more persuasive and meaningful love poem. Look at how it brings us right into a quiet, intimate silence. We're right there, watching two people trudge through the snow, hearing only the brushing of branches and the spurs on someone's boots. This experience, the poem tells us, is a dream. It's sweeter than any song, and with that in mind, how could this not be a love poem? But it's not an explicitly rhetorical declaration of love. Instead, it's a tiny moment preserved in poetry that captures and expresses an experience of love, the intimacy of being alone with someone and being able to hear the spurs of their boots on the way to the speaker's house. We don't need valentines and sweethearts to get the message. We just get two people and their quiet closeness in the snow. Really, this poem does what Ellen Bass says poems ought to do. We don't want to simply report. We want to enact an experience. And the most basic building block is detail. Detail, to be effective, must be both sensory and necessary. Details arouse, shape, and direct the reader's experience. Every description reveals what we think, feel, see, and know. Any description says as much about the writer as it does about the thing being described. And in this way, the distance between the writer and the reader collapses and intimacy is achieved. Actually, speaking of Ellen Bass, her poem, I Could Touch It, does exactly that. It creates an experience by providing the reader with details. The speaker's wife with the sack of rice on her belly, the olive tree blossoming and then swelling into bitter black fruit, her son farming up north with gritty hands and a straw-haloed head, and of course the son and his new love brushing their teeth, laughing and talking through their foamy mouths. Now imagine if Bass had just said, when my wife was sick, my son and his new love were here, and I wanted them here because they were happy, and being near that happiness helped me feel better. That's the kind of thing you might hear someone tell you at lunch, but it's not a poem. You might nod along and say, totally see where you're coming from, but building an experience of two loves, like this speaker's wife falling apart and the son's love blossoming, doing that out of specific details transforms it from a simple declaration into a poem. In college, I read Jack Gilbert's poem Married, and it has haunted my thoughts ever since. And it does it through the use of one dazzlingly specific detail. The poem opens with the speaker coming back from the funeral and collecting as many of his wife's stray hairs as he could find. Over time, other people visit, and it becomes impossible to know which hairs belong to the others and which to the speaker's wife. But then the poem ends here. A year later, repotting Michiko's avocado, I find a long black hair tangled in the dirt. Now, it may or may not surprise you to know how many times over the years I've thought about that singular hair tangled in the dirt. The details, the specific, unique, unmistakable details, make that poem. I've said before, and I'll repeat it until we're all sick of hearing it, broad, general writing does not make the poem more meaningful or relatable. I have never known anyone who has gone around collecting the hairs of their deceased wife, but it's the specificity of detail here that actually brings me into the depth of grief and the love that must have gone along with it. Specificity of experience just doesn't keep readers out. It's exactly what brings them in. Talking about love and grief in general terms will not make your poem better. Like all the poems we're looking at today, this is a poem only Jack Gilbert could write. But that does not mean that it's a poem that only Jack Gilbert could understand. In fact, quite the opposite. Now, one semester, when we were talking through this little collection of love poems, a student complained that they were all sad.
Well, it wouldn't be poetry if it weren't sad.
You're right about that, bud. Now, of course, happy poetry is possible, but these poems point us to another important thing that will make your poems more interesting, and that's tension, often in the form of emotional complexity. And that comes through very clearly in Ada Limon's Wife. In this piece, the speaker begins by saying, "I'm not yet comfortable with the word," and rehearses some specific details that highlight her reservations about the institution of marriage and the baggage associated with the word wife. "Why does it sound like a job?" she asks. "A word that could be made easily into maid," she adds. But that discomfort with the word wife and what it may represent is complicated by the speaker's actual experience as a wife. The one who wants to love you, but often isn't good at even that. The one who doesn't want to be diminished by how much she wants to be yours. Just think about any story you really love. There's a pretty good chance that you have a main character who must, by the end of the story, overcome some villain or other source of evil. In a lot of storytelling, the main source of interesting tension is between the hero and the antagonist. Poems aren't stories, though, so their tension often comes from complex emotions. In this poem, we have the tension between being uncomfortable with the construct of wife and the realities of being one. This poem puts us in contact with a person who wants to love someone but feels inadequate, who wants so much to belong to someone but not be diminished by that belonging. And this might be news to you, but there are people on the internet who love to post only the most self-flattering stuff. They have fabulous clothing, expensive food, the world's most caring and attractive partner, and an unlimited budget to travel to the world's greatest and most aesthetic locations. And I think most of us probably fall into a few categories in response. We either dismiss them with a resentful "must be nice," disbelieve them with a weary, just be a real person, or we tie ourselves up into knots wondering why our own lives don't live up to the standard of their carefully curated fantasy. None of those, I think, though, are attitudes you want to foster in your reader. And poems without tension, besides just being as boring as stories without villains, present artificial and potentially alienating views to your reader. I mean, tell me who you relate to and care about more. A poet who can't stop writing about how incredible it is being a wife, or a poet who is one and wants to be a good one, but is also wrestling with what it really means to be a wife. Now, I've never been a wife, but I have and do wrestle with all kinds of roles, ideals, and expectations. So reading Limon's poem puts me in contact with someone who is recognizably human, as full of complex and competing emotions and thoughts as me. And that's why, in general, a love poem with a little edge of sadness might be a better poem than one that's all red roses and blue skies. And that's all demonstrated so well in the piece Miss You, Would Like to Grab That Chilled Tofu We Love by Gabrielle Calvocaresi. I don't want to belabor the point too much, so you won't spend much time with it. But while you read it, notice how the poem builds an experience of love out of details, and then amplifies that love by contrasting it with that feeling of loss, of missing the person the speaker loves. And of course, notice the title. What a title! New poets are too quick to leave their poems untitled. So today, let's just all agree not to do that. You need a title. It makes all the difference in the world, so write one. Before we return to Guest for a little fire and brimstone, let's finish with Robert Wrigley's Do You Love Me? Because it makes a lot of sense for a love poem to be about two people in love, but I'd hate for you to think that that's the only kind of love that could inspire a poem. In this piece, we see a girl and her dog. Well, we see a girl interrogating her dog with the title asked in the question. The speaker observes that, of course, the dog loves the girl. The good dog sits and wiggles, leaps and licks, gestures that the poem says are themselves parts of speech. But the girl wants a verbal confirmation, and though the dog senses its own awful speechlessness and tries to bolt, the girl keeps a firm grip. She's got the dog's furry jowls in her hands. She's speaking precisely into its laid-back, quivering ears. Say it, she hisses. Say it to me. Specific details? Check. Emotional complexity? Check. A novel and surprising examination of love? Also check. This poem doesn't tell us things about love we already know. It gives us a new perspective through a unique experience. If you're a dog person, this might resonate in particular ways, but even I, who do not nor ever will have a dog, can see resonance with human relationships too. How does this girl and her dog show us something about the realities and complexities of relationships where two people express love in different ways, where a mismatch in expectations for how love is expressed obscure the reality of that love? As you've been reading through these poems, what do you notice about how they work? What do they have in common? What do they do uniquely? In other words, based on what we've talked about today, what are the qualities of a good poem? Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below.
Can we please do the evisceration now? I've tried to play nice and I'm running out of steam.
You mean the Guest poem? Yeah, let's do that. I mean, eviscerate is probably a little strong, but I do want to show you how I would comment on it if Guest were maybe one of my students, based especially on the principles we've looked at today. So let's begin with the first stanza. Okay, we've got an injunction to send someone a Valentine that says you love her in the same old way, but what does that actually mean? What is the same old way compared to what and who? And I really don't believe it was all laughter and delight because nothing ever is, right? Like that just doesn't seem real. And I don't know, but there's something about the last two lines here that make me a little uneasy. You can draw your own conclusions. And look at this second stanza. There's a whole life there reduced to a few generalized abstractions. There's an assumption that a life together comes with cold and wintry blasts, but we don't get to know about what any of them actually were. And this isn't something we've talked about, and it's not really a huge deal, but look at this. Joy and grief in battle are. That's not how we talk. But the sentence has to get twisted around so that it can rhyme with scar. Sure, it rhymes, but at what cost? Now, we still don't know anything about youth, actually, and the burdens aren't real burdens, just the idea of burdens. It sounds like the wife was fond and true, but this alleged husband needs to be lectured into sending her a Valentine, so I wonder what his deal is. And then, prepare yourself. That Valentine, get this, is going to cure her life of every ill. And I'm sorry, that just seems like an actual lie. Like, It's just irresponsible to say. There's no way to back up that promise. So see what I mean? As much as this poem gives us some pleasantly anodyne platitudes about love, none of it's real. There aren't details or experiences. It's all just ideas, and broad, generalized ideas that don't mean much. There's not a very satisfying tension in the piece, just an insistent command to send your old wife a Valentine. And the speaker isn't like the interesting, conflicted, and real person that we see in Ada Limon's poem, for example. This speaker is just a disembodied source of marital wisdom. Send your wife a Valentine and her entire life will be fixed. The audience of this poem seems to be a bunch of old husbands who can't apparently express love, but the speaker doesn't have that problem. The speaker has it all figured out. Must be nice. So I'm being a little more acerbic than I would normally be, because Edgar Guest isn't learning to write. He had a whole big career of popular success. So again, he can take the hit, but the larger point is that this poem is, in general terms, an excellent demonstration of what not to do. At least as long as you want to participate in modern literary poetry. And I think that's the key. You can always write what you want, but that doesn't entitle you to get the reader response that you want. Write like Edgar Guest if you so desire, but that's a choice that's going to leave the literary crowd pretty disappointed. Because of my background and tastes for poetry, I find Guest's work really unsatisfying because it doesn't create the kind of meaningful experiences that the other poems we've seen today actually do. It's just a pile of general ideas about love, and not very interesting ideas at that. It's all stuff I've heard before. It's not a poem only Guest could write, so because it is so generic and abstract in its approach, I don't really feel like this poem gives me anything that I couldn't get somewhere else. And if I can get it somewhere else, well, what do I need this poem for? The other poems we've looked at today, though, are irreplaceable. And that's because they don't fall into the same traps. So as we head into the rest of our poetic adventure, it's worth keeping some of these general principles in mind. If you want to write better poems, avoid these things. Broad generalizations and abstractions. Overly simplistic or one-note emotional tones. Sanitized or unrealistically self-flattering portrayals of experience. Irresponsibly authoritative pronouncements on human nature, the world, and more. Common, obvious, or cliched ideas or phrases, and as a bonus, rhymes that don't add much and force you to twist your language in knots. And it's all well and good for me to say these things and for you to hear them and nod along, but here's some homework. Homework again designed to inoculate you against the worst offenses against poetry, and also against the anxieties that may come with being told what you shouldn't do. Ready? Okay, I want you to write the worst possible love poem you can. Make it a real stinky stinker. Pile in the abstractions, the groan-worthy lovey-dovey cliches, the contorted syntax, and more. Make it as bad as can be. As you do, remember that number one, you're building an awareness of easily avoided issues by doing them on purpose. If you know how to do them intentionally, well, you also know how to avoid them just as easily. And two, you're helping yourself to realize that you can write something bad and nothing bad will happen. I'm telling you to write something bad today, but I'm also giving you extended permission to write bad poems for the foreseeable future. As this course progresses, we'll give you more tools and understanding to improve your poems. But the goal is not to write good poems at this point. The goal is to practice and to learn. I'm confident your poetry will get better as we go along, but it's unreasonable to think that they'll all be good all the time right from the start. So let's rip off the band-aid of ruined expectations and just write some sappy, saccharine, and shamelessly underwhelming love poems. For some added fun, consider sharing them on Discord, which is also linked in the description. But that'll just about do it for today. If you're watching this as it comes out, Poetry Month is coming to a close, but this course will continue along with our usual programming. So far, we've started with building a big vision for poetry and for the rest of the course to come. When we return, we'll continue building that foundation by thinking about your readers. In the meantime, though, keep on writing, and we'll see you again soon.